I want to start with this creature, the first example of a creature that Ingold calls a reindeer, but that we call a caribou. And so Ingold begins with this example of a caribou, and there's a nice looking caribou, and here's a not so nice looking caribou, a little scrawnier. But in this example, he begins with this example of the caribou or the reindeer turning to the hunter. Or, well, not a hunter, turning toward the pursuer, a moment when they stop and turn and face the pursuer. And the biologists tell us that this is the moment, the crucial moment of a chase in which they're pausing and turning when both are going to catch their breath, and that a healthy caribou can actually outrun a wolf in the final chase. And so in evolutionary terms, this is something that has probably developed as a response to predation by wolves, by the caribou being able to initiate this contact, it gives them an advantage in the final chase. And so for wolves, when they are hunting caribou, it's easy to find the caribou, but they're hard to get them. For human beings, though, when the caribou turns like this and looks the human being in the eye, I can almost see Gabe smiling back there. It's a great opportunity to just take a shot, whether that be with an arrow or especially with a firearm, easy kill. And so for humans, caribou are difficult to find. You have to find out where they are. But if they ever turn to you like this, you got them. Now, we have the scientific explanation, which is the evolutionary one. And so it's kind of been a mistake. It's like animals that cross the road at the wrong time and get knocked off by cars. They really weren't evolved to deal with cars. And so this is a response to predation by wolves, and they're not really evolved to deal with human hunting. But the Cree, and now Ingold is going into the example of the Cree, explain this in a very different way. That when the caribou looks at the hunter, this final moment is an act of giving itself up and an understanding that they are participating in this moment of regeneration, which is equated to love, or perhaps even sex. And so it's part of reproduction, regeneration, and that hunting itself is actually seen as not a violent activity, but as the animal has given itself to the hunter. Now, if we were in this place and we were thinking about these hunting stories from the scientific perspective, what we're going to call here mainstream Western thought for this course, and we'll have various modifications of that, but we'll kind of call it that. Ingold says here that the wildlife biologists are likely to react to this story with cynicism and incredulity, disbelief, right? Because it seems like the hunters are dodging or avoiding the ethical issue of taking an animal's life. They might be mad in the sense of crazy, or they might be, as he put it, lost in a fog. Are the folk who tell these stories mad, lost in a fog of irrational superstition, or simply having us on, fooling us, or talking in allegories? Are the folk who tell these stories mad, lost in a fog of irrational superstition, lost in a fog of whatever smoke that they've been smoking, talking in allegories, or having us on? Whatever the answer may be, science insists that stories are stories and as such have no purchase in what really goes on in the world. And so I guess in terms of our museum, the scientist doesn't care what the people think of what's being painted. It has no purchase of what's going on in the world. Whereas for the anthropologists, oh, there they are. They're having us on. They're having a joke at our expense. Whereas for the anthropologists, we are, of course, supposed to suspend our disbelief, right? We are not there to find out the truth or the veracity. We're not there to tell whether a belief is true or false. We're supposed to instead explain the culture, explain the cultural context so that it makes sense for them and for us. And to do that, we do our field work and we get their perspective. And in our museum, we go around and we talk to all the people about the meanings that they would have in order to draw out what anthropologists call a worldview or a cosmology, a belief system. And in this belief system, of course, it would make perfect sense that the animals are involved in this relationship and giving themselves up to the hunters. And so we do this in order to take kind of a more general perspective on what is often seen as an opposition between what we do here in anthropology, what we do down here in Jaeger, and what they do in other places like Johnstone and science departments and those kinds of places, which is that mainstream Western thought is generally thought to be this sort of objective, singular perspective on the world, which has produced everything that is true. Whereas when we come into this place, we are often taught to put things into context, to talk about cultural relativism or relativizing our systems, and we try to question those assumptions that people have about the world, to interrogate their worldviews and to interrogate our own worldview so that we can draw these issues into question. And so what we come up with is, and we'll talk about this more in the next class, is this idea of perceptual relativism on page 15, that people from different cultural backgrounds perceive reality in different ways since they process the same experience in terms of alternative frameworks of belief or representational schema. So the idea is, we in some ways all have our cultural background, which leads us to interpret the same stuff in the world in different ways. Now, for most of the time, in most anthropology classes, this is way good enough because it calls into question most of what people think. And, it's probably for 99% of anthropology classes, that's where we can stop, because that's pretty radical for most people to do. The whole idea of perceptual relativism is out there in some ways, is pretty intense. And so just to wrap our minds around that idea is hard enough. And so we just stop. In this class, we're going to push beyond that in the sense that what we're going to be doing, there's my 3 little letter codes, we're going to be interrogating this standard anthropological response. We're going to be often using Ingold to do it, because what Ingold is in some ways claiming is that the standard anthropological response doesn't really disrupt mainstream Western thought. It simply is complementary to it, in that here we have the biological sciences supposedly examining the objective world of nature, and we have the anthropologists examining all the stories about nature. So it doesn't have to at all. It's perfectly complementary. And so what we're going to be trying to do is to push beyond standard anthropology to really question what goes on in so-called mainstream Western thought. And I wanted to expand upon this a little bit because I think it parallels, although Ingold himself is not part of these particular movements, but it parallels, I think, what is going on in anthropology generally, and I think is perhaps going on in all of our lives. So on the one hand, we have Western thought and anthropology. And I've here put Western thought in quotation marks, and we've just come off of a cultural anthropology class where I think we've been examining some of these things. Because I think that it's probably fair to say that when it comes to what we call Western thought, that has been an enterprise of the elite, of the upper stratosphere of so-called Western society. And it's been an enterprise of whiteness. And it's been an enterprise of maleness, certainly with some exceptions, but as a general rule, that's where this perspective has come from. Now, anthropology has insisted that we widen the field. And so in anthropology, we learn that we shouldn't just be studying the elites, we should be studying people everywhere. That anthropology should be open, not just to the upper crust of society, but to all people. And part of what we do as anthropologists is go out from elite institutions and listen to people who are out there in the world to try and understand their wisdom and their knowledge. And we would say to the whiteness part, we would say, hey, you may have heard of this person. We have Franz Boas, who spoke out against the idea of race and proved that that race was much more mutable than was previously suggested, and laid a foundation for a very different kind of thinking about race. And to the male stuff, we would say, hey, we have Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, some of the earliest and best and most well-known anthropologists were women who were often persecuted within academia, but nevertheless laid the groundwork for anthropology as an academic discipline and certainly as a popular in its reception in the world. So I think that in anthropology, we often claim this, what we might call a radical tradition. We often claim that we are questioning Western thought. But I also don't think it is perhaps debatable, or it's something that's actually being debated right now, is all that anthropology stopped short of, which is to say that we stopped short of taking a perspective of decolonization, in the sense that we retained this idea of elites studying other peoples without, in some ways, without taking those perspectives seriously as ones that might interrupt our own, or that might truly be an alternative to Western style thinking. I think it's becoming clearer that we also stop short of a truly anti-racist perspective. And some of the things even that people are going back and looking at some of the things that Franz Boas was talking about and how he sort of, he seems to have been able to make race less salient when it came to European immigrants and the kinds of distinctions that one made between European immigrants, but less able to do that when it came to African Americans. And we're not going to get into the particulars of that, but there was a belief, I think, in anthropology that if we just showed that race was a social construction and was not valid, that would be enough, that we didn't need to actually adopt an anti-racist political position. And in some ways, anthropology stopped well short of adopting an anti-racist tradition. And certainly, if we think about the other person who Franz Boas trained, Zora Neale Hurston, who worked closely with Boas for a while, and other indigenous collaborators who also were instrumental to Boas's work, it seems more obvious that anthropology really did not. We don't hear about Zora Neale Hurston, the anthropologist, or if we do, it's because it's a later reclamation, but that was supposed to be part of the thing. She became a famous writer, but anthropology didn't really confront anti-Blackness within the discipline, and other people have argued that we really didn't incorporate feminism or feminist theory very well either, even though there were some prominent women and that was a prominent perspective within the discipline. It didn't become a seriously feminist discipline. And all this stuff, of course, is, well, maybe perhaps I might not say of course, but is playing out today if we open up our Anthro Twitter feeds. So Ingold himself is perhaps blind to some of these perspectives, and we're going to have to read other things and be attentive to them, to this perspective, to get that. But nevertheless, I think he's on the right track in terms of how anthropology, although it claimed to be oppositional to and interrogating some of the Western stuff, didn't really push the critique far enough. So we'll be using Ingold to push this critique as far as we can, and when we need to, we'll be going beyond that in order to get to these other perspectives. So with that said, I think we'll go back into the Ingold, where he is interrogating the standard anthropological perspective. And so in Ingold's view, this response from anthropology is to suspend disbelief about these stories. It appears that it's oppositional, but it actually simply results in what Ingold calls a double disengagement. That when we say that these hunting stories are a cultural construction imposed upon or superimposed upon nature, we do a double taking out, a double disengagement. First of all, we have taken humans out of nature. So humans are the ones that have culture, other creatures don't. And then we take the anthropologists out of culture so that other people are trapped in their own cultures and anthropologists are surveying from above. And so we get to that example that I believe may have been, if I'm not mistaken, the basis for Gabe's comment about the museum. And here we have anthropology is the viewer of views, viewing worldview and worldview two. I guess those are the people in the museum, or they could be the artworks. And then science is investigating that real nature of reality, the workings of nature, without caring what the people up above nature think about it. So we have anthropologists at both anthropologists and the scientists would make a claim to having a universal reason, but in this sense, we have a double taking out of the world. Once removed, people are removed from the world of nature, and anthropologists are standing above and admiring the worldviews of different societies. So if we want to go beyond that, We want to go beyond standard anthropology. Ingold says that we need to retrace the two steps in the reverse direction. So we need to go back in, first of all, in order to level the ranking between indigenous accounts, or the accounts of people that we want to think about, and in order to try and really take other people seriously and see if we can gain something from that approach. If we can do better science, better anthropology, learn something about life from truly taking people seriously instead of doubly disengaging ourselves. So he then goes into some of the place where we have some of the giants of anthropological thought or anthropological theory. And he's sort of revisiting two big people you may have encountered along your anthropological travels. But the way I'd like to frame this is that what he's doing is he's looking at these two persons who are considered justly to be giants of anthropological thought, not just because of their ideas, because of what they can tell us about life and the way they live. And I guess I would say in this class, if it ever feels too much like we're going into some sort of strange theory world, it's getting too cerebral, just let me know and we'll try and figure out what it means for our living stuff. So the two people are Gregory Bateman and Claude Levi-Strauss. Ingold takes them as Bateman first, who is part of the Bateman's book, The Ecology, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, is part of Ingold's subtitle, except he changes it to Steps to an Ecology of Life. I'd like to actually start with Claude Levi-Strauss's view here, which is in Ingold's view that, in fact, Claude Levi-Strauss, although he tries to dissolve some of the boundaries between mind and world, results in this idea that there is a mind, a contained mind, that is apprehending a world that is out there, and that information, our way of perceiving the world, comes from the world into the mind. And so what happens is that the mind is engaged in a process of decoding information. And in some ways, we know that the information is out there, and this is getting in sort of cerebral Levi-Strauss territory, because the world and the mind are themselves of the same structure. And so we are able to decode that information according to binaries and other the famous oppositions of structural anthropology. Whereas Bateman, lecturing around the same time in the 1970s, sought to explicitly dissolve the boundary between mind and the world. And he gives the example of what Ingold calls the blind man's cane, and Bateman probably called the blind man's cane, but we're going to call it the blind person's cane, which is that where is the mind and where is the world as the person is scanning the environment as they move through the world. There is no boundary, or where would you draw the boundary between where the mind happens and where the world happens? And for Ingold, what he says is that this sort of sweeping with a cane is in a similar way of we have sight, where we scan the world with our eyes, so that we aren't simply sitting there absorbing information, that we have to be moving through the world. And that's how we are apprehending information, through actively moving through the world. And so this is not a process of decoding, but a process of revelation. of having the world revealed as we move and experience and actively go through it. Which is probably why Ingold would say that the whole exercise of projecting information to seated students who are not actively moving is maybe not the best use of education. We need to be out there in the world, moving through it so that it is revealed. So he has a kind of schematic comparison here of Levy Strauss, the mind, which is the same as the brain, and the world out there. And of course, it passes over, but it's because of a structure of decoding, whereas Bateman has this kind of the brain the brain and the world are part of each other, and there's not a firm place where you can draw a line between them. In the mid-chapter, Ingold then goes into a small section that I think is important before we start talking more in the next class about this idea of communication revelation, which is this idea of the environment and what we need to know about the term the environment. For Ingold, the environment is always a relative term because it is always something that is relative to the organisms that inhabit it. And the organisms in the environment are a totality, which is always developing and in process. And so he's in many ways objecting to a term like nature or a term like the natural environment, because when we classify an environment or a place as nature, we have done that, we have begun that disengagement. We've become beings that take ourselves out of it and stand apart from it. And so we should not confuse the environment with nature. And one of the huge objectives of this book is to put human beings into the world and to consider our perspective as humanity within a world, not apart from the world, as actively engaged in it. So that's where we get to in this chapter. We'll talk hopefully in the next part about bringing these strands together, about moving and learning and how we learn things. I want to show you a few pictures of the people. That's some people. Ingold is still alive. That's a fairly recent picture, I think. He's being in nature there, getting immersed in the world. So there's Ingold. On the left, Gregory Bateman. On the right, anthropologist Rio Fortune, who was at the time, well, I'm not sure exactly when this picture was taken, but was married to Margaret Mead in the middle. Then, I don't know, somehow Gregory Bateman broke that thing up, and then he got married to Margaret Mead. And they had one daughter, Mary Catherine Bateman, who was also a really excellent anthropologist and scholar. The only, I just found this out recently, the only child of Margaret Mead. They, I think, later split up again. And then Mary Catherine Bateman recently passed away. She passed away last year in 2021, at the age of 81. That's Gregory Bateman more at the time, probably around the time that he gave this lecture that he was thinking about. He spent much of his later life in Santa Cruz, California, looking very, I don't know. Nobody was fixing the buttons on his shirt, I guess. A famous picture of Claude Levi-Strauss in Brazil during the early years, the early Claude Levi-Strauss. If you ever get a chance to read Tristes Tropiques, it's not exactly anthropology, but it is a great travel book. I think it begins, I hate travel books, and then proceeds to talk about these things. He's probably more famous from his older pictures where he becomes, he was old for a long time. He passed away in 2009 at the age of 100. So he survived most of his critics. And it's interesting in here, one of the things that I've always been struck by is that Ingold really takes Levi-Strauss to task for being, separating mind and world. And he's not a Levi-Strauss fan in this book at all. But recently, and I actually pondered whether I should assign this book to this class. It's called Wild Thought. It's one of Levi-Strauss's, it's probably his burst on the scene masterpiece. And it just came out in a new translation of, my French is not great. Actually, I don't speak French at all. I shouldn't say my French. I don't know French. Does anybody speak French?
Yeah.
How would you say that top part?
Under translation.
Yeah.
La pensée sauvage.
Yeah. So new translation called Wild Thought. And there's Tim Ingold on the back. And so it was curious to me that, after Ingold takes him to task so much, all of a sudden he's like, wow, this is great. Curiosity of the author, but also the countless people whose conceptual wizardry spills out onto the pages. So I think what Ingold's saying is that you finally get a sense for how much Levi-Strauss was enamored of the thought of others outside of the Western tradition. And then this part, in engaging in delightful prose, Wild Thought lets Anglophone readers at last. And that's the problem, is a lot of the things that Levi-Strauss said, and this is true of other French theorists, got badly translated into English, terribly translated, so that people would come up with the weirdest ideas about them. So what Ingold is saying here is that finally us English speakers can relish the sheer joyousness and ingenuity of an unparalleled intellectual adventure. So maybe Ingold is coming around a little bit to Levi-Strauss now that we can read a better translation. Because the book for a long time was titled The Savage Mind in English, which is not the best title. So this is a much better title. So it came into English as The Savage Mind. And I often wondered about this. My own mentor, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, when I was in graduate school. So his most famous work is actually an essay called Anthropology and the Savage Slot, in which he argues how that in some ways the place of anthropology was given before anthropology came along as a category in Western thought, in which anthropology is assigned to study all the people out there who the West would consider savages. And so in this work, what Trouillot says is what anthropology needed to do is to explicitly attack the idea and the conceptual apparatus of the savage slot. And so I was very puzzled when I got into his graduate seminar, and the first thing he did when we started reading Levi-Strauss was he said that Claude Levi-Strauss had, more than anyone else in anthropology, displaced or attacked the idea of the savage slot, which was weird because here was Levi-Strauss writing this book called The Savage Mind, which does not seem to be an attack on anything. It seems to be something that you would pick up and read about the mind of savages, right? And so it finally dawned on me, like, why Trujillo was able to say this, probably because Trujillo, as a scholar from Haiti and a speaker of French, was reading Levi-Strauss in the original French, and so he didn't have to bother with the translation stuff, and so he could actually read La Pensée Sauvage without getting interrupted by this terrible English translation. But also because Levi-Strauss's core argument, despite the terrible translation and the terrible title of the book, was that it was for the brilliance and the essential equivalent of the minds and thoughts of people out there, and how we should take them incredibly seriously in comparison to what we might call Western thought. And so, I mean, Trujillo was correct that in some ways Levi-Strauss did displace this idea of the savage thought, but unfortunately it lived with us for a long time and still does, because it was titled as The Savage Mind.